The scripture reading this morning is from the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, and verses 1 to 11. Hebrews chapter 4, 1 to 11. Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us, just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them, because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Although his works were finished from the foundation of the world, for he has spoken somewhere of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works. And again in this passage he said, they shall not enter my rest. Since therefore it remains for some to enter it, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, again he appoints a certain day, today, saying through David so long afterward, in the words already quoted, today if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. For the word of God is living and active, sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing to the division of soul and of spirit, of joints and of marrow, and discerning the thoughts and intentions of the heart. And no creature is hidden from his sight, but all are naked and exposed to the eyes of him to whom we must give account.
Thank you, David, for reading for us this morning, and welcome everyone. It's wonderful to be here this morning and to see all of you present, and to welcome you, especially if you're visiting with us today. We're glad that you're here. Life is busy, and people are busy with their jobs. There are meetings to attend, deadlines to meet, people to see, letters to write, reports to make. People are also busy with their family responsibilities. There are children to take care of, school meetings to attend, help with homework, shopping, cleaning, and doing jobs around the house. All of these things need to be done. We look forward to having a holiday, but we come back from holiday wanting another holiday to get over the stress of the last one. And we feel weary and exhausted, and we just wish we could have a few moments of rest. Jesus knew the importance of rest, of finding a time to get away from it all. In Mark chapter 6, verses 30 to 32, we're told that after Jesus had sent the apostles off on their mission, they returned to Jesus and they told him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, come away by yourselves to a lonely place and rest a while. For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. Jesus wanted to take his apostles away to a quiet place where they could just have a time of rest. The Apostle Paul also knew what it was like to go without rest. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 5, he says, for even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn, fighting without and fear within. It is important for our physical well-being for us to get a proper rest, a proper time of rest. But sometimes it just seems impossible to find that time. In the passage we're looking at this morning in Hebrews from chapter 3 from verse 7 through to chapter 4 verse 11, the writer talks about the importance of finding rest. And he looks at some events that happened to the Israelites in the past and draws some lessons for Christians from them. So let's see what he has to say about rest in this passage. When Moses led the people of Israel out of their captivity in Egypt, he was to take them to the land that God had promised to give them. And that land is described as a land of rest in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 9 and 10. For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which the Lord your God gives you. For when you go over the Jordan and live in the land which the Lord your God gives you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all your enemies round about, so that you live in safety. The land that God had promised to give to the people would be a place of rest and safety for them. This was what God had promised. But the writer to the Hebrews tells us that there was one generation of the Israelites, those who left Egypt under the leadership of Moses, who failed to enter that rest, and they failed to receive what God had promised them. In Hebrews chapter 3, verses 7 to 11, the writer is quoting from Psalm 95, a psalm that's attributed to David. And he warns the people of his day, David's day, of the lessons that are to be learned from the history of Israel. The Psalm 95, is referring to an incident that occurred during the time when the Israelites had left Egypt and they were in the wilderness. Do not harden your hearts as in the rebellion on the day of testing in the wilderness, where your fathers put me to the test and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was provoked with that generation and said, they always go astray in their hearts. They have not known my ways. As I swore in my wrath, they shall never enter my rest. There were many occasions in the wilderness when the Israelites rebelled against God and put him to the test. And the incident being referred to in Psalm 95 is to be found in Exodus chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. And it happened soon after the people had left Egypt, but before they came to Mount Sinai. The people complained to Moses about the lack of water. They asked why Moses had led them out of Egypt just to die of thirst in the wilderness. When Moses asked God what he needed to do about this, God told him to strike the rock, from which would then come water, and the people could drink. And the place where this happened was then given the double name of Massah and Meribah, meaning proof and contention. Because we're told in Exodus chapter 17, verse 7, of the fault finding of the children of Israel, and because they put the Lord to the proof by saying, is the Lord among us or not? This incident was not just about water. It was about trusting in God and in his ability to provide for his people. And there at that place, the people had displayed their rebellious nature, their lack of trust in God, and their provocation of him. And this was just one of many similar incidents that occurred. And the final straw, and the incident that provoked God into preventing these people from entering that land of rest, is found in Numbers chapter 13 and 14. When the people came to the verge of entry into the promised land, Moses, under God's instructions, sent 12 spies into the land of Canaan to assess its strength, to see what the inhabitants were like and how strong the cities were, and to see what the produce of the land was like. It was to be a fact-finding mission before an invasion. When the spies came back, they reported that the land was good, but the inhabitants there were strong and they lived in these well-fortified cities. Two of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, encouraged the people to go up at once and occupy the land, believing that God, with God's help, they would overcome it. But the 10 other spies produced a negative and a discouraging report, telling the people they would not be able to overcome the land's stronger inhabitants. It was this lack of trust in God that spread throughout the people. And so they complained against Moses again, saying, well, it would have been better just to have stayed in Egypt and to die there, rather than come out here and die in the wilderness. And they began to talk about replacing Moses with someone else who would lead them back to Egypt. But God was angered by this rebellious attitude of the people. In Numbers chapter 14, verses 26 to 30, we read this. And the Lord said to Moses and to Aaron, how long shall this wicked congregation murmur against me? I have heard the murmurings of the people of Israel, which they murmur against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, what you have said in my hearing I will do to you. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness. And of all your number, numbered from 20 years old and upward, who have murmured against me, not one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. Except for Caleb and Joshua, that whole generation who were aged 20 and above, who had left Egypt with Moses, all of them would die in the wilderness. They had provoked God by their rebelliousness, by their hard-heartedness and their lack of faith in him. God had had enough of them, and he swore in his wrath, they shall never enter my rest. So here in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 16 to 19, the writer gives us this explanation of Psalm 95, which he's just quoted from. He asks, who were they that heard and yet were rebellious? Was it not all those who left Egypt under the leadership of Moses? And with whom was he provoked 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the wilderness? And to whom did he swear that they should never enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. A whole generation of Israelites failed to enter the rest that God had promised because of their unbelief, their lack of faith in God and their lack of trust in him. They had heard what God had said he would do for them. They'd seen many examples of God's power and God's goodness, and they benefited from the provision that God had made for them, but they just would not trust him. They wouldn't obey him. And consequently, God said they would be excluded from that entry into the land of rest. And so the writer to the Hebrews uses this experience of the Israelites to now teach his own readers a lesson. In chapter 3, verse 12, he says to his readers, take care, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil, unbelieving heart, leading you to fall away from the living God. It was an evil, unbelieving heart that caused those Israelites to rebel against God and lose that entry into the land of rest. And so to prevent us from having such a heart, the writer goes on to say in verse 13, but exhort one another every day, as long as it is called today, that none of you may be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. Here's a practical lesson for us, that one way for us not to be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin is for us to encourage one another every day. We need one another. We can help one another to stay faithful. Why do we come together today, every Sunday? Why do we come together at other occasions? We come together to build one another up, to exhort one another, to encourage one another to keep going. In verse 14, the writer says, for we share in Christ, if only we hold our first confidence firm to the end. We must hold firm to the end. Hold firm the confidence that we had when we first became Christians. And by being together in this way, we can encourage one another and we can keep going right to the end. One generation of Israelites failed to enter that land of rest that God had promised to give them because of their lack of faith and their disobedience. The generation who left Egypt under the leadership of Moses died in the wilderness. And it was left to Joshua to lead a new generation into that land of rest, to conquer it and to occupy it. And Joshua chapter 21 verses 43 to 45 records how God gave them that rest in the land. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land which he swore to give to their fathers, and having taken possession of it, they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. Now, although Joshua had led them into the land and God had given them rest, the writer to the Hebrews now tells us that this rest, the rest they received in the land, was not to be the final or the ultimate fulfillment of the rest that God had promised, because the promise of a better rest still remained. In Hebrews chapter 4 verse 1 he says, "Therefore, while the promise of entering his rest remains, let us fear, lest any of you be judged to have failed to reach it." And that better rest that he speaks of here is likened to God's rest on the Sabbath day. Here in Hebrews chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, he says, "For we who have believed enter that rest, as he has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall never enter my rest, although his works were finished from the foundation of the world. For he has spoken somewhere of the seventh day in this way, and God rested on the seventh day from all his works." God created the world in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And in chapter 4, verses 8 to 10, the writer says, "For if Joshua had given them rest, God would not speak later of another day. So then, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. For whoever enters God's rest also ceases from his labour, as God did from his." And so we see here that the writer has used this example of the experience of the Israelites in failing to reach their land of rest as a warning and as an encouragement. That we have the promise of entering a rest that is like the rest that God enjoyed on the seventh day after he had created the world. This is the ultimate, the better rest for us to enjoy. The Israelites failed to reach their land of rest because of their disobedience and their lack of faith. They missed out on God's promise. But we have a better promise of entry into a better rest. But like the Israelites, we too are warned that we shall fail to enter that rest if we do not show faith and obedience towards God. But what is this better rest that is promised to us? It is the rest that Jesus has promised and which he has provided for us. In Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30, Jesus said, "Come to me, all who labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Jesus has promised to give us rest if we come to him. It's not a promise of physical rest. It's not a promise of a comfortable life of luxury and ease somewhere on the beach or lounging around the swimming pool. But it's a promise of a spiritual rest, a rest for the soul. We struggle each day under heavy burdens. Sins weigh us down. Worries and anxieties press down upon us and cause us to become spiritually weary and exhausted. Well, Jesus promises to relieve us of those burdens and instead to replace them with his easy yoke and his light burden of service to him. Jesus is the one who provides us with rest for our souls and ultimately rest in heaven itself. And when we come to Jesus in faith and obedience, seeking his rest, we can experience the joy of salvation and the peace of mind that he brings. And we sense the lifting of our burdens. Jesus provides us with this rest now in this life. But this life is a hard life. It's a life of service to Jesus, and we still look forward to that final rest of heaven itself. In Revelation chapter 14 and verse 13, we read, "Blessed are the dead who die in the Lord henceforth. Blessed indeed, says the Spirit, that they may rest from their labours, for their deeds follow them." Heaven will be that place of ultimate rest from our labours, when we shall be forever with Christ. The Hebrew writer encourages us to enter this rest. In chapter 4, verse 11, he says, "Let us therefore strive to enter that rest, that no one fall by the same sort of disobedience." To enter this rest requires some effort on our part. He says we have to strive to enter it. So it's not something that is easy or that we take for granted. And if we are to enter this rest, then we must continue to live a life that is characterized by our trust in God and our obedience of his word. In chapter 4, verse 3, he says, "For we who have believed enter that rest." The writer warns us that disobedience of the same sort that characterized the Israelites will cause us to miss out on this rest. In verse 6, he says, "Those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience." The writer to the Hebrews is teaching us an important lesson here from Israel's past. The one generation of Israelites lost out on the blessing of entry into the promised land of rest because of their persistent disobedience and their lack of trust in God. And from this we can learn that disobedience to God and unfaithfulness will prevent us from enjoying the things that God has promised. God's promises are conditional upon our faithfulness. And we're warned here not to follow the example of those unfaithful Israelites. Like them, we have heard the good news of God's promise of a rest for us, a rest that Jesus offers, that Jesus provides for us, a rest that finds its ultimate fulfillment in heaven itself. And we reach that rest by living that life of faithfulness. We must keep going in our Christian life, staying faithful, giving encouragement to one another, building each other up, so that we may all enter that rest that God has promised. Life can be weary and tiring. We feel exhausted, and all we want is a time of rest. Well, in the midst of our busy lives, we can have this rest that Jesus offers, and we can look forward to the ultimate rest of heaven itself, promised by God to all who remain faithful and obedient to him. I thank you for being here this morning, and thank you for listening, and may God bless you. Amen.